They were barely a month old. Two tiny golden retriever puppies, tied to a tree in the dead of winter. No blanket, no food, no mercy. Their fur was frozen stiff, their whimpers barely whispers, and the snow kept falling. Dozens of people passed by that road. Not one stopped. Not one, until she did. A grieving mother, lost in her own sorrow, stumbled upon their suffering. What she did next. It didn't just save them. It may have saved her, too. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that no soul deserves to be thrown away, hit that subscribe button. Because this one will stay in your heart long after it ends. The wind screamed through the bare, skeletal trees, cutting through layers of winter bark and stirring up powdered snow that danced in cruel swirls. The forest outside of Glenshire, a sleepy, frost-bitten town on the northern edge of New York State, lay still beneath a sky the color of old bruises. A blanket of silence wrapped around the woods, thick, suffocating, and final, until it was pierced by a sound so fragile it could have been mistaken for the moaning of the wind. It wasn't the wind. It was a whimper, thin, ragged, and desperate. Buried under the tangle of snow-laden branches, not far from a rusted fence post that marked where the forest gave way to private land, stood a gnarled pine tree. Around its base, nearly indistinguishable from the white earth, were two small lumps. Upon closer glance, they weren't lumps. They were puppies. Golden retrievers, maybe a month old at most, their matted, gold-flecked fur stiff with frost and filth. A twisted length of rusted wire bound their frail bodies to the tree trunk, cutting cruelly into the soft fur of their bellies. One had already stopped moving, lips blue, eyes half-lidded in frozen resignation. The other still shivered, its weak body trembling violently, a tiny pink tongue flicking out as if tasting the last breath of hope. They should have died unnoticed, but fate intervened. Clara Merriweather adjusted the burlap sack over her shoulder, the weight of canned food and medical wraps digging into her spine. She had planned this trip to the volunteer shelter just south of the woods, like she did every Thursday. It was routine, an attempt to tether herself to something steady after everything else had slipped away. The wind nipped at her cheeks as she took the long-cut trail. That trail used to be her son's favorite route. Clara was a tall, sinewy woman in her late 50s. Her once dark hair was now a crown of ash streaked with silver, usually pulled into a fraying bun. Lines etched her sun-weathered face, not the gentle kind from laughter, but the deep grooves of someone who'd wept quietly for far too long. She wore a forest green parka, faded from time, thick corduroy pants tucked into old hiking boots, and a scarf her son had left behind. Her gray-blue eyes, dull from months of grief, scanned the woods automatically, unseeing, until she heard the sound. The whimper again. She stopped dead. Her breath caught, misting in front of her face like smoke from a forgotten fire. There it was, a twitch of movement behind the half-buried pine. She hesitated, then stepped off the trail, crunching over snow and fallen limbs, toward the sound. What she found made her stagger back. Two puppies, barely alive. Clara dropped to her knees, nearly falling into the frost. Her gloved fingers fumbled at the wire, old and barbed in places. One pup had a swollen eye, its ribs sharp against her palm. The other had urinated itself in fear, the ice clinging to its hind legs. Clara's heart stuttered. "No, no, no," she whispered, voice cracking like ice underfoot. She slid the sack from her shoulder, pulling out the emergency blanket she always kept at the bottom. She wrapped the more lifeless pup first, pressing it gently to her chest. It didn't move. The second one gave a faint squeak and licked at the wool of her scarf. The tears came before she could stop them. Clara hadn't cried like this since the funeral. Her son, Evan Merriweather, had been a firefighter, 27, brave, stubborn, and loyal to a fault. When the apartment complex collapsed after the gas explosion, he had already pulled 3 children out. He went in for the 4th. They found his helmet 2 weeks later, buried beneath concrete and hope. After that, Clara had left the city. She bought the little cottage near Glenshire that no one wanted, with its leaky pipes and peeling shutters. She needed the silence, but not even silence could drown the ache. Until now. Until 2 tiny souls wrapped in pain forced her into motion. She didn't think, she moved. Cradling both puppies against her, she tightened the scarf around them, stood up, and began the half-mile walk back to her truck. The trail was steep and treacherous. Her boots slipped twice, and once she fell hard onto one knee. The snow drank the sound of her groan, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't. Not again. 15 minutes later, breath ragged and hands trembling, Clara reached her battered blue pickup. She laid the pups in the passenger seat, turned on the heat full blast, and began rubbing their paws gently. "You're not dying today," she muttered through gritted teeth. As the heater groaned to life, the smaller puppy, limp and cold, gave a faint twitch. Clara gasped and clutched it closer. Her scarf was damp now with melted frost and tears. In that moment, something shifted. The silence in her chest, the frozen, useless grief she had carried like an anchor, began to thaw. She didn't even know their names, but they were hers now. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling like a wounded thing. The forest behind her stood quiet once more, but not empty. Not anymore. Somewhere deep in the snow, where two dogs had been tied to die, Clara had found a reason to fight again. And this time, she wasn't going to lose. The house smelled faintly of cedar and chamomile as the wood stove crackled to life. Clara stood near the hearth, holding the damp bundle of towels that had once been her thickest bath linens, now soaked with melted snow and puppy urine. She dropped them into the basin by the door and turned toward the couch, where two golden-furred figures lay curled under a wool blanket, their breathing shallow but present. The smaller one, still with a bluish hue at its lips, hadn't stirred since they'd arrived. The other, slightly larger, kept its chin atop the frailer pup's neck, watching Clara with wide, intelligent eyes the color of warm maple syrup. "I suppose you need names," she muttered to herself, kneeling by the fire with a jar of homemade salve. She reached for the stronger one first. "You," she touched the tip of its snout. "You're Scout. I can tell already. Always watching." The puppy blinked slowly, but its tail gave the faintest twitch under the blanket. "And your brother here, Dusty, because that's what you feel like ash and dust and something waiting to be reborn." Dusty didn't respond. His breathing remained shallow, his body curled tightly, legs trembling involuntarily. Clara's fingers, firm but gentle, traced the lines of his body under the light of the fire. That's when she noticed the strange swelling on his hind leg. The joint was bent slightly outward, not in a natural way, more like something that had been broken and left to heal without care. She ran her hand up further and found scabbing along the inner thigh, the kind that looked like burn marks, uneven, round patches of bare skin and mottled scar tissue. She hissed softly, "Oh, sweetheart, what did they do to you?" Clara had seen wounds before. She'd been a nurse for 17 years before retiring early after Evan died. That was a lifetime ago now. Back then, she had tended to burn victims, accident survivors, and the elderly with ulcers from neglect. But she had never imagined she'd find those same traumas on something so small, so innocent. Scout whimpered and nosed Dusty's ear, licking it repeatedly. Clara paused, her heart tightening. She placed the salve down and rubbed the side of Scout's neck soothingly. "You won't eat unless he eats, huh?" she murmured. She had tried earlier, poured warm goat's milk into a shallow ceramic dish, crumbled up boiled chicken, even warmed up the bone broth she'd made for herself. Scout sniffed each one, but never touched a bite, until Dusty tried. But Dusty had no strength to even lift his head. Clara stood and walked to the kitchen. The window over the sink showed the dark expanse of her yard, where the wind moved the snow in ripples like a frozen ocean. She glanced up at the calendar hanging by the fridge. January 12th. The shelter run would have to wait. From a drawer beneath the sink, she pulled out a pair of surgical scissors, tweezers, and a magnifying glass. Returning to the couch, she gently lifted Dusty's head, brushing the singed fur around his neck. That's when she saw it, a jagged seam in the lining of the torn collar. She leaned closer. There was something inside. Clara reached for the scissors and carefully cut along the seam, revealing a dull, metallic chip half the size of a thumbnail. It had once been embedded into something more advanced, likely a tracking or identification device. But now it was scratched and partially melted at the edges, as if someone had violently removed or deactivated it. Clara held it in her palm, breath caught. Why would anyone put this in a collar and then try to destroy it? The question hovered in the room like a ghost. She needed help, but she also needed to be cautious. There weren't many people Clara trusted anymore. After Evan's death, she had shut the world out. But there was one name that came to mind now, a woman named Marla Greaves, who ran the Glenshire Animal Wellness Clinic. Marla had once been Evan's vet school mentor, before she'd changed careers to work in rural rescue. In her mid-60s now, Marla was broad-shouldered, with wild copper hair and dark skin that had weathered decades of sun. Her voice always carried a hint of sarcasm, but her eyes were kind and sharp. Clara picked up the phone, hesitated, then dialed. It rang twice. "Clara Merriweather," came the voice, rich and direct. "Haven't heard from you since the funeral. Are you all right?" Clara's voice caught. I found 2 puppies. In the woods, tied up. I don't know how long they had been there, but they were freezing to death. One's not moving much. I think the other's got some kind of trauma. There's burn marks, and something else, a chip in the collar." Marla didn't hesitate. "Bring them in tomorrow, first thing. I'll cancel my appointments. You said burn marks? That's not wildlife, that's man-made." "I know," Clara said softly. After hanging up, she sat in the worn armchair across from the fireplace, watching as Scout curled tighter around his brother. The firelight danced on their fur, casting gold into the shadows. Clara leaned forward and picked up the chip again, studying it. Her nurse's intuition whispered something she hadn't wanted to consider, that these puppies hadn't just been abandoned. They'd been disposed of, like failed experiments. Broken, maybe even tested. The door creaked slightly in the draft. She turned and looked out the window again, beyond the yard, toward the tree line. Who had done this? And more importantly, why? She would get answers. She owed them that. But first, Dusty had to live. The snow had crusted overnight, leaving the forest floor glazed in a sheet of ice that crackled beneath Clara's boots. It was just past 7 a.m., the air sharp and dry, the kind of cold that seeped through layers and clung to the bones. Her breath fogged in front of her face as she stepped carefully off the main trail and into the pine clearing where she had found Scout and Dusty only 2 days earlier. She moved slower now, scanning every foot of ground with a nurse's eye for detail. Her back still ached from the fall she'd taken carrying them out, but she ignored the pain. There was something here, something more than a random act of cruelty. She could feel it. Beneath the tree where the wire had been coiled, the snow was disturbed, not fresh, but not yet erased by time either. She crouched, brushing away the frozen crust with a gloved hand. A faint groove led from the tree line toward the service road, 2 parallel lines, like tracks. Not from a car, but wider than a bicycle. She followed them several yards until they disappeared beneath the drifting snow. To the left, something caught her eye, a black trash bag partially buried under an old log. She hesitated, then tugged at the plastic. The bag tore open, and the smell hit her first. Chemical, bitter, with a coppery undercurrent. Inside was a tangle of blood-specked gauze, a snapped IV line, and several used syringes. Some of them had veterinary labels. She stood slowly, the nausea rising. This wasn't just neglect. Someone had been treating, or experimenting on, something out here, and they had tried to cover it up. Footprints led away from the site, adult-sized boots, heavy-soled, recent enough that the edges were still defined. Clara photographed the bag with her phone, then the prints, and tucked the torn plastic into another bag she'd brought with her. She turned back, heart pounding. There was no more denying it now. Whoever had done this wasn't just careless. They were methodical. Later that morning, Clara stood at the threshold of the Glenshire Sheriff's Office, unsure if she wanted to step through. The building was modest, red brick, 2 stories, the kind of structure that looked more like a post office than a place of law. Inside, it smelled like old coffee and cold air. The man who greeted her behind the front desk wore his uniform like an afterthought. Badge off center, sleeves rolled just high enough to show faded Marine Corps ink. Sergeant Quinn Adler looked up from his paperwork and smiled when he saw her. "Clara Merriweather," he said, standing. "Now, there's a face I haven't seen in a year. You look determined." Quinn was in his mid-40s, tall with a lean, weathered build, the kind earned by a lifetime of chasing bad guys and shoveling driveways at dawn. His close-cropped hair had gone mostly gray at the temples, and he carried a permanent squint that hinted at a once-broken nose. His jaw was square, dusted with stubble, and his voice held a faint drawl from upstate roots he'd never quite shaken. A combat vet turned small-town cop, Quinn had known Clara's son since he was in middle school and had served in the honor guard at Evan's funeral. "I need to talk to you," Clara said, skipping the pleasantries. Quinn gestured toward a small interview room off to the side. She followed him in, handed over the photos from her phone and the torn black bag. As he listened, The usual patience on his face hardened into something else. Concern. "So, let me get this straight," he said, setting the phone down. "You found two puppies, tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere, both showing signs of abuse. One of them has a leg that looks like it healed wrong, both have old burn marks, and you dug this out of their collar?" He held up the scorched chip she'd shown him. Clara nodded. "And someone's been doing something out there. Syringes, gauze, vet gear. It's not just dumping, it's organized." Quinn rubbed his temples, then sighed. "Clara, I want to believe this is a misunderstanding. Maybe someone ran an amateur clinic out in the woods. Maybe they panicked and—" "Stop," Clara cut in, voice low. "Don't do that. Don't talk to me like I'm fragile. I know what I saw. I was a nurse. I've treated burn victims. And that chip, someone tried to destroy it. Why destroy a microchip unless you don't want it traced?" Quinn leaned back, arms crossed. For a long moment, he said nothing. "I'll run it," he finally said. "I'll see what I can get from the chip. Not promising much, it looks fried, but I'll also send someone to the site." "That's all I ask," Clara said. That night, after returning home and feeding the dogs, Scout finally nibbled at the chicken broth while Dusty lay asleep. Clara walked out to her mailbox. The sky was starless, black as pitch, and the forest behind her was utterly still. She flipped open the mailbox and froze. There was no mail, just a single sheet of paper. She pulled it out with a trembling hand and unfolded it under the porch light. Block letters, all caps, typewritten, "Stay out of what doesn't belong to you." No name, no signature, just a message. Her heart beat like a war drum in her chest. She scanned the yard. Nothing. No footprints, no car lights down the gravel path, just the long, cold night and the shadows at the edge of the trees. Clara stepped back inside and locked the door. She held the note for a long time, then fed it to the wood stove flame. It curled in on itself and turned to ash, but the fear didn't burn away with it. A week had passed since Clara received the note. It still echoed in her mind like a ticking clock. Stay out of what doesn't belong to you. But Clara Merriweather had buried a child. What more could they threaten her with? Fear had become background noise, white static beneath the roar of grief, and now something new had grown in its place. Resolve. It was Quinn who picked her up that morning. His black SUV crunched up her gravel drive under a gray iron sky. Clara had bundled Scout and Dusty into a warm corner of her living room before stepping out. Dusty had gained some strength, still shaky, still slow, but breathing steadier. Scout, always the guardian, watched her every move from the couch, tail twitching nervously. Quinn stepped from the driver's seat, gloves already on, face tight with the weariness of too many late nights. "You ready for this?" he asked. Clara nodded and climbed in without a word. The drive to the kennel took less than 15 minutes, but the scenery shifted dramatically. The trees grew taller and tighter here, branches clawing overhead like arthritic fingers. A forgotten road branched off the main highway, half covered in snow and dead leaves, leading to a property surrounded by leaning fence posts and rusted wire. At the far end stood a two-story barn-style structure, peeling red paint. No signs, no lights, no life. The name of the place had once been Maple Glen Breeding and Boarding, once a celebrated kennel that bred golden retrievers for show competitions and law enforcement contracts. Now it looked like it had been carved out of time and left to rot. As they approached the gate, Quinn glanced at the chain looped through it. "It snapped," he muttered. "Somebody's been in here recently." They passed through. Inside the main barn, the air smelled of mildew, urine, and old metal. The darkness was thick, broken only by Quinn's flashlight. Clara kept close, eyes darting across the space. Rusted cages lined both walls, their doors hanging open. Some had thick claw marks etched into the metal bars. Others had hair, golden strands, clinging to the hinges. Near the back, they found a room that had once served as an office. A steel desk coated in dust sat beneath a shattered window. The filing cabinets had been pried open, their contents scattered, but one drawer remained stuck. Quinn forced it open with a grunt, revealing a plastic box labeled Tracking, Litter Group AF. He pulled out a yellowed document. "Chip registry," he muttered. "Looks like they cataloged every litter. Here, Group D." He pointed to a row. "Chip D14620, D14621, D14622. Clara leaned over. Her heart skipped. "That's the prefix I saw on Scout's collar fragment." Quinn's mouth tightened. then that means these pups were bred here, trained here, or worse. Deeper in the barn, another door led to a room that required a key card, long since deactivated. Quinn kicked it open. Inside were the machines. A metal contraption resembling a restraint table stood in the center, fitted with old leather straps and sensors. An outdated shock collar controller sat nearby, its switch cracked. The floor was stained and covered in fur, and in one corner, a dusty camera still hung from the ceiling, its cord snaking toward a forgotten server in the wall. Quinn tested it. The green light blinked faintly. "Still has power," he said. "Old school hard drive backup. Let's see what this bastard left behind." He removed the panel and pulled the drive. "We'll need tech to open this, but it might have everything." Clara stood still, staring at the table. Her breath had gone cold again. "Someone used this to hurt them," she whispered, "to train them through fear. That's not training, that's torture." They left the barn in silence. At the edge of the property, Quinn made a call to the sheriff's office, requesting evidence pickup and surveillance for the site. As he spoke, Clara wandered toward a small shed half covered by vines. Inside, she found a box labeled "Returns." Inside were torn collars, some tagged with numbers, others with initials and sizes. A few had red dots painted on them. She picked one up. It had the letters RB stamped into the leather. "Quinn," she called out. He joined her and frowned. "That stands for Raymond Bolts," he said, "owner of Maple Glen. Claimed bankruptcy when the place closed down. There was a lawsuit 2 years ago. Accusations of abuse, medical testing on rejected litters. He walked. Lack of evidence." Clara clenched the collar. "He didn't walk. He disappeared. Where is he now?" Quinn sighed. "Last we heard, he moved to Brookvale, lives in a rented cabin off Lake Orison, keeps to himself." Clara's jaw tightened. "I want to see him!" "No," Quinn replied firmly. "He's not someone you go knocking on. Let me talk to the DA first. If we have something, we do this right." But Clara wasn't listening. Her eyes drifted back toward the barn, its dark mouth still open, like it was waiting for something to crawl out. She knew monsters didn't live under beds. They lived in places like this, in silence, in systems, and they always left a trail. The morning after Clara's visit to the forgotten kennel dawned in a steady curtain of freezing rain. The icy drizzle tapped softly against her window panes, but inside her small cottage, warmth pulsed from the wood stove, and the breath of 2 sleeping puppies gave the house a rhythm it hadn't known in years. Dusty lay curled in a makeshift bed of towels and flannel, his ribs no longer visible under fur, though one leg still trembled when he shifted. Scout sat near the fireplace, his eyes always on the door, always on guard. Clara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and fingers resting lightly on the keys. On the screen was the final edit of a short video. She had spent most of the night pulling it together, footage of Dusty taking his first unsteady steps, Scout refusing to eat until his brother did, the burn marks on their legs, and a close-up of the melted microchip fragment. She had layered it with soft narration, her voice steady but raw, filled with restrained pain and quiet fury. She hadn't named names, not yet. But she asked the world one simple question. What do we become if we let this happen without asking why? She clicked publish. Within the hour, the video had reached a few hundred views. By midday, it had crossed 10,000. Animal rescue pages shared it. A retired vet in Oregon reposted it with the caption, "This woman is asking what we all should." Comments poured in, grief, rage, support. Strangers wanted to send blankets. One woman in Kansas offered to pay for Dusty's x-rays. And then, nestled between well-meaning comments, was one that made Clara's heart stop. "I worked there. I tried to stop it. I let those 2 go. I couldn't save the others. Please don't say my name. He'll find me." Tesselson. Clara clicked on the profile. It was nearly empty. No posts, no videos, only a profile picture of a young girl with wide, dark eyes and tightly curled hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her expression was blank, almost fearful. Clara responded cautiously, "I believe you. Please message me. I won't let anyone hurt you." That evening, while Clara fed Dusty a mix of warm goat's milk and blended oats, a private message came through. "Meet me at the Rusty Bean Cafe tomorrow, noon. Sit alone. If I see someone with you, I'm gone." Clara shared the message with Quinn. "She could be a scared kid, or she could be the key to cracking this wide open," he said. "Go. I'll stay outside. I won't let her see me." The next day, the sky had turned to gray ash. and sleet slicked the sidewalks of downtown Glenshire, Clara walked into the Rusty Bean Cafe 10 minutes early. The place was warm, filled with the smell of espresso and cinnamon. Behind the counter, a young barista with pink hair waved, but Clara moved straight to the back booth by the window. She didn't have to wait long. Tessa Langley entered with her hood up and hands shoved deep into the sleeves of her oversized sweatshirt. She was 17, but looked younger, small, bird-like, with long, thin fingers and skittish eyes. She had a bruised sort of presence, like someone who had spent too long being told to stay quiet. She slid into the booth without a word and stared at the table. "I'm Clara," the older woman said gently. Tessa nodded once, then spoke quickly, as if afraid the words would betray her if she hesitated. "I worked at Maple Glen the last 2 summers. Ray paid me cash, said it was under-the-table training for animal care. I thought I was doing something good." Clara didn't interrupt. She let the silence be kind. "He started small, keeping the puppies in crates too long, skipping feedings. Then came the collars, said if they could handle pain, they'd obey faster." Tessa's voice cracked. "He tied some of them up when they failed, said he was testing thresholds. That's what he called it." She took a breath. "Scout and Dusty, he called them Batch D. There were 5 originally. Dusty was the runt. Ray shocked him hard the first day. Said if he didn't stand up straight, he wasn't worth the food. Scout, he barked, bit Ray's glove, so Ray chained them to the wall. No food, no water." Clara's knuckles whitened on her teacup. "How did they end up in the forest?" Tessa stared out the window. "I tried to help them. That night, I waited until Ray left to make his supply run. I cut the collars, grabbed a reader, tried to remove their chips. I botched Dusty's, burned it. Scout just stared at me the whole time like he knew I was trying." Her eyes shone with tears she didn't let fall. "I couldn't carry them far. I was scared. I dragged them to the edge of the woods, near the old fence line. I left them with water. I thought maybe someone would find them, but Ray must have tracked them. I heard him yelling later that night. He took them, didn't bring them back inside, just disappeared with them." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think he tied them out there to die. That's what he did with the ones who didn't obey." Clara closed her eyes, chest tight. "I didn't speak up before," Tessa said, "because he said the last girl who did. She vanished. Nobody found her. He said I'd be next." Clara reached across the table and touched Tessa's hand. "You didn't fail them," she said. "You gave them a chance, and now you're giving them justice." Tessa swallowed hard. "If I testify, will you protect me?" Clara nodded. "I'll burn the world down before I let him touch you." The girl smiled for the first time, just barely. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Not the sleet from earlier, but soft flakes, silent, steady, covering the town like a second skin. When Clara left the cafe, she found Quinn waiting in the car across the street, engine humming. She climbed in, her coat damp with the snow melting against it. "She'll testify," Clara said. Quinn looked at her. "Then we take this all the way." Back home, Scout met her at the door. His tail thumped once, then again, and Dusty raised his head from the blanket, eyes bright for the first time in days. Clara looked at them both, her heart full. The road was still long, but justice at last had a name. The courthouse in Brookvale stood like a stern old sentinel against the gray spring sky, its stone pillars streaked with decades of rain and time. That morning, the steps were lined with reporters and onlookers, some holding signs, others just curious. Above them all, banners flapped in the breeze. Justice for the voiceless, no mercy for monsters. The nation had been watching for weeks, but today was the first time the accused would be seen in public. Raymond Bolt stepped out of a county transport van in a gray jacket and handcuffs, flanked by 2 deputies. His hair, once slicked and black, had thinned and grayed at the temples. He was still tall, broad-shouldered, but softer now, the belly under his coat straining against the buttons. His face wore the blandness of a man who had already rehearsed his lies. When the first camera flash popped, he smirked faintly, like this was just business, and the rest of them were playing dress-up. Inside, the courtroom was a contrast of tension and silence. The high ceiling echoed every shuffle and cough, the hardwood floor reflecting a dull sheen beneath the harsh lights. Clara sat on the left side gallery with Quinn beside her, his uniform freshly pressed, jaw clenched. Dusty was at home with a trusted volunteer, but Scout sat at Clara's feet, leash wrapped around her wrist. He wore no vest, no collar, just a quiet resolve. His eyes never left Raymond. The judge, a woman named Eleanor Hart, took the bench precisely at 9 a.m. She was in her early 60s, with short silver hair, deep creases around her mouth, and an expression carved from granite. She had a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, and a deep affection for her 3 rescue dogs, which hadn't gone unnoticed by the press. The prosecution opened with forensic photos, images of Dusty's burns, the X-ray showing the improperly healed fracture, the shredded collar with chip debris still fused inside. Clara felt her throat close, but she didn't look away. The gallery was silent except for pens scribbling and breaths being held. Raymond's defense attorney, a slick man in an expensive blue suit named Nolan Wexler, rose and countered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with a soft, almost soothing voice, "this case is built on tragedy, yes, but also on assumptions. My client ran a legal, certified breeding facility. He employed teenagers, many unsupervised. He donated to local shelters. There is no video of him committing any act of abuse, no direct evidence, only bitter stories and the misinterpretation of what was necessary behavioral correction." Clara's nails dug into her palm. Then Tessa took the stand. Her hair was pulled back into a simple braid, her jeans stiff, oversized coat zipped to her neck. She looked small under the court lights, but stood with a quiet defiance that silenced the room. "Did you work for the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes. 2 summers. I was paid in cash." "Did you witness abusive behavior?" "Yes." "Can you describe it?" Tessa's voice didn't tremble. Dogs were shocked repeatedly for not sitting fast enough. Puppies were isolated for hours without water. Some were hit. Some were tied to trees and left for days. I helped remove collars. I saw him strap a shock device to a 5-week-old. I tried to stop it. Raymond leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Wexler stood. "Objection. This is hearsay." The judge overruled him. Tessa continued. "I took 2 puppies, Scout and Dusty. I couldn't carry them far. I left them near the woods. I thought they might survive. They were found days later, tied to a tree. I believe he found them again after I tried to save them." The courtroom shifted like a wave passing through fabric, chairs creaking, pens pausing. Clara watched as Tessa stepped down. She didn't look at Raymond. She didn't have to. Later, a tech from the state forensic lab took the stand and presented the camera footage retrieved from the hard drive found at Maple Glen. The video was grainy, time-stamped, but clear enough. A scene flickered onto the courtroom screen, Raymond dragging a leash, a golden puppy thrashing behind him. He looped the leash through a post, pressed a device to the dog's neck. It screamed. The judge's face turned pale. Raymond's defense collapsed like wet paper. Then, during a recess, something unexpected happened. As the bailiff escorted Raymond past the gallery, he glanced sideways at Clara, lips curling in a mocking grin. Just a flash, just enough. And that's when Scout snapped. The golden retriever launched forward with a deep, visceral snarl, yanking Clara halfway from her seat. The room gasped. Scout surged toward Raymond, barking, growling. Nothing wild, nothing confused. It was specific, deliberate, like something inside him had been waiting for that face. Clara dropped to her knees, pulling Scout into her arms. He trembled, not with rage, but memory, pain remembered. She pressed her face into his fur and whispered, "No one will ever hurt you again. Not ever." Judge Hart struck the gavel for order, but said nothing more. The silence that followed was its own kind of justice. The trial extended over 5 more days. Witnesses came from other towns, former employees, a volunteer from a shelter who had adopted a dog returned from the kennel, shaking and mute. Raymond tried to deny everything, but the mountain of evidence buried him. When the verdict was read, guilty on 6 counts of felony animal cruelty and unlawful destruction of property, he showed no emotion. But Clara saw his fingers tighten, ever so slightly, on the table. He would serve 8 years, no parole for the first 5. Outside the courthouse, snow had begun to fall again, light, gentle, indifferent to the ruin below. Reporters called Clara's name. She said nothing. Scout walked calmly beside her, tail low, head high. The world was watching. But for Clara, justice wasn't a headline. It was a heartbeat under golden fur. 6 months had passed, but it might as well have been a lifetime. Winter had loosened its grip on the Hudson Valley, and the world unfurled in color again. Buds pushing through thawed soil, the river moving freely under pale morning light. and songbirds returning to sing where silence once ruled. At the end of a gravel road lined with blooming wild daffodils, Clara Merriweather's cottage stood transformed, not by paint or renovation, but by the life it now held. The porch had a new swing, the garden had a new fence, but most of all, the air around the house carried the laughter of children, real, echoing laughter, as they played beside a golden blur of motion named Scout. The once wounded puppy had grown into a tall, lean retriever with a glossy coat and intelligent eyes. His scars had faded, but not vanished. Clara had insisted they stay visible. "They're not marks of shame," she had told the vet. "They're proof of survival." Scout had earned his certification as a therapy dog in record time. His gentle nature, unwavering patience, and intuitive responses to fear made him a favorite at the Elmwood Center for Child Trauma Recovery, where he now spent his Thursdays curled next to children too frightened to speak, letting them rest their small hands in his fur until the world seemed less terrifying. Dusty, too, had changed. Though smaller and more cautious, his spirit had bloomed. Physical therapy had helped rebuild his back leg, and while he still walked with a soft limp, he ran now, short bursts, tail wagging high, especially when Clara whistled from the garden. His fur had grown in thicker, his eyes brighter, and though he didn't love strangers the way Scout did, he loved Clara, and that was enough. That morning, Clara stood by the kitchen window, drying a mug. Her hair was pulled back, streaks of silver catching the sunlight. The deep sadness that once lived behind her eyes had softened into something calmer. Not joy exactly, but peace. She had earned it. On the windowsill sat a photo of Evan in his firefighter uniform, grinning, and beside it, a new one. Clara, kneeling in the grass, Scout leaning into her, Dusty beside her pawing the dirt like a child testing spring. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was from Tessa. "Guess who got the internship offer? Full scholarship confirmed. Also, my latest blog post got picked up by Paw Nation. Just wanted you to be the first to know. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Clara smiled as she read it. Tessa Langley had changed too. Once a girl hiding in the shadows of abuse, she had stepped into the light, earning not just the respect of advocacy organizations, but also a scholarship from the National Rescue Youth Alliance. Her blog, Tied But Not Broken, had drawn thousands of readers, and she had become a voice for other young volunteers who had witnessed cruelty but never felt safe enough to speak. They met every month for tea, and Tessa had recently brought her aunt along, a stout woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked dreadlocks named Marlene, who wore oversized sweaters and carried a tote bag full of baked goods. "You better believe I'm keeping my eye on this one," Marlene had said, ruffling Tessa's hair with the stern affection only a protective aunt could offer. On the television in the background, a newscaster mentioned the sentencing of Raymond Boltz without much fanfare. 8 years, no parole for 5. The world had moved on quickly, as it always did. But Clara didn't need headlines. She had something better. That afternoon, she brought out 2 bowls and placed them under the maple tree behind the house. Scout and Dusty bounded toward her. The grass was lush again, no longer frozen. Clara sat on the porch steps, the sunlight warm on her face, and watched as the dogs chased each other in wide, uncoordinated circles, tails high, paws pounding into the soft earth. Where once had stood a place of mourning, now bloomed something unspoken and full of breath. She thought of Evan often, not as a wound anymore, but as a presence. The swing had been his idea once. The garden was planted with seeds from his old tin box. His ghost lived gently here, not haunting, just watching. "Scout," she called. He skidded to a stop, tail wagging, tongue lolling. "Come here, boy." He bounded up to her and pressed his head against her chest. Dusty followed more slowly, flopping beside her with a grunt and looking up with content, squinting eyes. She laughed, really laughed, and the sound echoed across the yard. She leaned down and whispered, "I thought I saved you, but maybe it was you who saved me." Scout licked her cheek once. The wind stirred the maple leaves above them.
In her journal that night, Clara wrote a single sentence.
"There are ropes that choke us, and there are ropes that bind us to life again." And this time, it was the dogs who held the other end. Some stories remind us that not all miracles come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they arrive on 4 trembling legs, wrapped in matted fur, with eyes too tired to hope, until someone sees them. What happened to Scout and Dusty wasn't just a rescue, it was a resurrection, of life, of purpose, of faith. Maybe God doesn't always speak through burning bushes. Sometimes he whispers through a puppy's heartbeat, a stranger's kindness, or a quiet old woman brave enough to care. And maybe the greatest miracles aren't the ones that change the world all at once, but the ones that change one soul, one backyard, one morning filled with laughter instead of silence. If this story touched your heart, please share it.
Leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from.
And if you believe that every life, no matter how small, deserves love, click subscribe and help us keep telling these stories. May God bless you, and may you always have the eyes to see the broken and the courage to lift them.